All right, so let's begin with this topic called Egypt. As you know, Egypt's been in the headlines a bit lately, a bit too much maybe, for the wrong reasons. And I would like to start off with a story that happened, a recorded story that happened prior to the revolution. Just before the revolution, there was a huge wedding held at the Four Seasons in Cairo. And it was, a business tycoon marrying the daughter of a very wealthy figure. And the who's who of the Egyptian elites were there. And they had Gulf royals and bankers and you name it. And someone was asked at the event, what do you think of tonight? What do you think of the event? And he replied, it feels like it has a Tsarist Russia on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution feel to it. And how right he was. However, those Tsarist structures have survived, unfortunately, and it's put us on a different trajectory. Now, many often ask me, was it a real revolution? And my response depends on what you think a revolution is. How do you define a revolution? Because if you see it as 18 days, like the military council of Egypt does, then it's not a revolution. To me, a revolution is not an event, it's a process. It's like me going back in time to 1791 and asking a Frenchman, what do you think of the revolution, the French Revolution that happened 2 years earlier? It's impossible. And just like Kissinger asked, in the early 1970s, asked the Chinese premier, what do you think of the French Revolution? And the premier replied, it's too early to tell. Yes. The revolution is going through phases. I would say now it's decentralizing. We saw a Tahrir-centric phenomenon early on. Not to say it didn't happen in other parts of Egypt, it did, but very limited. And now we're seeing the revolution decentralizing and penetrating rural areas in Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt and the Suez Canal cities. Now, just to recap, and thank you, Colin, for giving me a recap as well, but I'll just briefly just say that it was a youth-led movement that started, that chose Police Day on the 25th of January to lead the uprising. But it did end with the military coming on side of the protesters and bringing it to a closure by ousting the Mubarak regime on the 11th of February 2011. Now, many Egyptians will tell you that the revolution was about bread, freedom, and dignity. And it's the dignity aspect that always gets overlooked. And dignity is connected to how Egypt sees itself in the world. And Mubarak is viewed as having damaged, even destroyed, that image, that prestige that Egypt has had as a leader of the Arab world. And the origins of Egypt's protest movements, despite the fact that it might look like a domestic phenomenon, are heavily connected to the international relations system. We've seen events like Intifada that happened in 2000, and the Iraq War in 2003, and the Lebanon War in 2006, and the Gaza War with Israel in 2008, 2009. And what these all had in common was that Mubarak was complicit in all of them. And this angered many Egyptians, and it gave dress rehearsals for the protest and activist movements. Interestingly, the turning point was also the international dimension. And that was when the Tunisians kicked out their ruler. The Egyptians could have none of that. The fact that Tunisia upstaged the mother of the world basically shamed them into action. As one blogger on the streets of Cairo said in mid-January, they kicked out a dictator, and it's only Tunisia. And it's like the equivalent of New Zealand upstaging in Australia, in whatever event you can think of. So I will be looking at the internal dynamics and how that has a spillover effect into external relations. But what I'll be discussing also is the political deadlock that's happening in Egypt, and the narratives and the characters that are being formed. Sorry, I'm a bit tall, it's a bit awkward. Okay, as you might have noticed also that Egypt is in a little bit of a mess. Okay, so foreign currency reserves in 2 years have declined from $36 billion to $13.5 billion, and enough to cover only 3 months of imports. And this has made it more problematic because the IMF wants to give a loan to Egypt, but it's demanding that it, for example, kill off its subsidies. which every political leader in Egypt knows that you just don't do that, or will lead to the bread riots of 1977. And so Egypt is in a major crisis at the moment, because now the Brotherhood want to do it after the parliamentary elections, and that's been cancelled and being appealed. And Egypt has a lifeline of 3 months to go. The skyrocketing inflation, reduced tourism revenue, capital flight, lack of foreign direct investment, and high levels of unemployment. And Egypt has been branded more dangerous for tourists than Pakistan and Yemen. It's not there, it's not looking pretty at all. And the reality is that the new political order is not able to be formed due to deep-rooted socioeconomic problems. Egypt is running on a dysfunctional bureaucracy, defunct institutions, corruption, and inefficiency, and lack of trust from the public. Politics is just not about instant solutions, and this is what many people miss. Okay, Egypt has had a constitutional referendum, it's had elections, presidential elections and parliamentary elections, but these procedural democracy features don't work. They're necessary, they're needed, but there is no leadership to tell Egyptians, this is the 5-year plan we have, like they did in South America. You know, there needs to be a sort of a step-by-step plan shown to Egyptians. But what the Egyptians are seeing is elites bickering over the spoils of the revolution, who will take what. Okay. And it's not just the socio-economic angle, it is the configuration of power in Egypt that sheds more light on the current situation. Keep being stuck in sticky tape at the bottom. Yeah, not much of a gap. Oh, okay. Awkward, anyway. Okay. So according to Hasan Kanto at Cambridge, so what he was noting is that the power triangle that existed during the Mubarak era depended on an uneasy partnership underpinned by US aid money. So the army had become the least privileged partner in Egypt's ruling bloc. We didn't know this. This is actually new revelations. We always thought the army was the top during the Mubarak era. As they grew, the army grew alarmed at the diminishing regional influence that Egypt had, and more so with the rise of Turkey and Iran. The uprising disturbed this delicate balance, and the consequences that it enhanced the leverage of the military. What it did was it left the security establishment largely untouched, and created a political vacuum which Islamist revolutionaries and former regime loyalists scrambled to fill in. Now the power triangle is easy to comprehend now, but now it's gone just a little bit more complicated. Okay, I just want to make it clear, this is not a scientific diagram. This is based on news data, on voting patterns and policy statements. I wouldn't take it literally, but because they're always changing by the weeks and the months as well. Okay. So what we're saying is that Egypt is currently trapped in a balance of weakness. None of the key actors have the power to consolidate a new regime or even resurrect the old one. And what we're seeing is shifting of alliances. So okay, we had after the revolution, we had the Muslim Brotherhood in the revolutionary camp was practically one camp. And then after the revolution camp is forming alliances with the former regime elements, reluctantly, very reluctantly, by the way, shall I add. And one of the reasons was the Islamist discourse after the revolution, the election of Morsi, was more empowered, and there was nothing sophisticated or strategic or subtle about their language, and it alarmed many people in the cities about the rising Islamist influence. So it brought them together. And you might ask, why can't Muslim Brotherhood just form an alliance with the secular camp? It can't, because the key element is the Salafists who make up a key constituency of the Muslim Brotherhood will not accept any agreements with the secular revolutionaries. Now, there has been a pact that's been signed between the Muslim Brotherhood, or there has been backward deals, should I say, between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. And we saw that in August when there was a big fanfare about the generals who were retired, but they got quite good positions. No one was prosecuted for any crimes they committed. And then Shantawi and Anand were given honorary decorations, and high-ranking officials were given posts like heading the Suez Canal and so forth. And also, an important point is that Morsi allowed Egypt or the Egyptian military to buy drones from Turkey, which is interesting given that the dependence on US aid, but it shows a shift, it's starting to show a shift in US policy, Egyptian policy. The other giveaway was that the military could keep a secret budget from parliamentary overview, and military trials would continue. Now, the interesting thing of all this here is the interior ministry. Because how did the interior ministry survive? The revolution was against them. Police did. The police brutality that led to the 25th of January revolution. And it's basically the revolution, the interior ministry was very strategic in dealing with Egyptian citizens. To be clear, they have a deep hatred for the revolutionary camp. They see them as having upstaged their prestige and status. But what the past 2 years has shown is that they have been not just strategic, but in the beginning they pretended to be reformed, I would say. Like if you met a police officer after the revolution, they were so nice. So nice it creeped you out, you know? So then there was selected massacres at times in places of activists. And we saw that in Port Said last year with 79 Egyptians who were massacred in that. Now, the military did want to reform or to entertain the idea of reforming the interior ministry, but there was no other political player to fulfill the Mubarak vacuum. And so they had to rely on the interior ministry, or there would be pure chaos. And recently I was actually pleased, but I made a mistake being pleased when I discovered the Egyptian police went on strike, demanding they're not politicized, they don't fight for the Brotherhood. However, one of their demands was that they want to use more lethal force. It's enough that people are dying by the dozens every day, but they're demanding more force. And the problem with the ministry is that if you don't resolve this, you cannot resolve many of the problems in this power balance. And so just looking at the international supporters, we can come to this during question time. They're divided along ideological, geographical, and legacy lines. Okay, so supporters may not necessarily be financial, but ideational. For example, the Muslim world, the Muslim world here, for example. I'll explain in a second. The Obama administration is there for pragmatic reasons. It's not out of a love for the Brotherhood. Yeah. But they are supporting because of no other option. They can't rely on the revolutionary camp because they're divided. The Muslim world often has a very idealized image of Egypt, and it tends to forget the dynamics and the play, and associates the Muslim Brotherhood with good governance simply because they speak the language of the religion. Despite the fact that Al-Azhar University, which is the oldest institute and the seat of Sunni Islamic learning, is actually considered in the revolutionary camp. Saudi Arabia is another interesting one. It does not support actually the Muslim Brotherhood, but it supports the Salafists who support the Brotherhood or support the Islamist project in any case. And we have other players such as Hamas, who are an offshoot. With any Muslim or militant groups across the world, you will find a strong connection between the Muslim Brotherhood, or because of it is seen as the mothership. But we can come to this later. Okay, Hani Shokola at Al-Ahram Online, although he's been kicked out by the Brotherhood who've taken over the state media, describes the Brotherhood in this way. Like that compulsive gambler, the Brotherhood, firmly bent on capturing Egypt's state and society in one fell blow, are inherently unable to cut their losses, but rather are constantly, with growing desperation, betting on the next hand and the next throw of the dice, and the one that will compensate them for their losses and lead them to fortune. Now, just to give an overview, they were born in 1928 as a social organization, a religious charity and an organization, and they've been greatly under repression for most of their lives. Now they peaked during the 1950s and 1960s under Nasserism and President Nasser, and this actually played a part in radicalizing some of their offshoots in the prison system. And under Sadat brought them out of the cold to counter the left-wing Nasserists, and then under Mubarak the Brotherhood alternated between repression and appeasement. They were initially against revolution, but they came a few days later and sided with it. They have won parliamentary and presidential elections, as we've seen, but it is generally displaying an obsessive compulsion to take over state and society. The current mindset, as Maher Hamoud has described, is this opportunity happens once every 84 years. In contrast to its early history, where it was more sophisticated and had a very sophisticated approach to politics, the converted tactics became an extremely rapid one, spreading power by all democratic means, referendums and elections, and non-democratic ones, alliances and military, and the business elite, as well as religious manipulation. And so this is partly explained by the lack of vision. They kicked out the most sophisticated members in 2010. And right now you've got a very archaic structure. And many of the youth, what I would call a progressive youth, have left. And so yes, and there is also a tendency to be conspiracy driven, as Morsi, the president of Egypt, tweeted a few days ago. There are foreign forces trying to invade Egypt, or trying to infiltrate Egypt. And look, apart from all that, there is a backlash. There's the loss of legitimacy. They're losing university elections and syndicate elections, such as journalists and pharmacists elections, etc. And they're suffering from the decentralization process that is happening. Now, the National Salvation Front, as described by Hazm Kamal, for example, never has such a grand name been assumed by such a mediocre body. This front brings a coalition of all the revolutionary figures and opposition figures, parties, names, groups together, youth movements into one group. It's got three leading figures. Mohammed al-Radari, he's the nuclear chief watchdog, and global lawyers, and he's seen as cosmopolitan, urban, what middle class each wants to be like, but he lacks initiative and a sense of strategy. And if you listen to his lectures, they can drive you mad in the sense that there is no vision that he's trying to push for Egypt. Amr Moussa is a former foreign minister and former head of the Arab League, and he's perceived as a closet opportunist. And the hardcore revolutionists cannot see eye to eye with him because of his past. Hamid Sabahi is probably a more popular one. Looks a bit like Bill Lemon. Is seen as a more credible, but his platform is nostalgia. He promotes Nasserism. He doesn't really have any concrete plans for Egypt except reviving a 1950s and 1960s discourse. And they still don't know whether they want to boycott boycott the parliamentary elections coming up or participate in it. This is how divided they are. And the fact that they feel that 6 revolutionary candidates, despite this is actually the biggest political actor, but the most disorganized, but 6 revolutionary candidates ensured they were losing the elections. Humility is not really a revolutionary trait. Okay, now, despite the political differences, there is a generational and ideational war that is taking place in Egypt right now. Nabil Abdel Fattah has written a book in Arabic called AIIA and Revolution, State, Political Islam, Nationalism and Liberalism. Abdel Fattah discusses Egypt's dysfunctional elites, be it military, political, or from the Brotherhood, who are unable to absorb the gravity of the events of 2011. This explains why the old elites are unable to generate a post-revolutionary project or post-democratic movement, because some of the old elites view the events of 2011 as a mere democratic protest movement. And I quote from his book, "The majority have not absorbed the nature of the event and the end of the legitimacy of 1952 with its generation's ideas and legacy. The conflict is still at its peak and reveals 2 speeds running together in Egypt. One attached to the legitimacy of 1952 and another claims a still unclear revolutionary legitimacy." And I'll give you a microscopic example of this. I took the train from Alexandria to Cairo on the eve of the first year, 1 year, so 24th of January last year, 1 year after the revolution, to be with my friends in Tahrir Square. And the army was recalled from Alexandria to come to Cairo, to look after Cairo. I happened to be on the carriage where everyone was an army, everyone was a soldier, and I was sitting next to the general. I made the mistake of wearing a beret, and so my politics was given away. And I got dirty looks, and towards the end of the train ride, I started to strike a conversation with the general. And I asked him 15 minutes before I got to Cairo station, asked him, "Is everything going to be okay?" He says, yes, everything will be fine, in Arabic, of course. Perfect, everything will be fine. Then I asked him a question about the Tahrir girl who was beaten up a month earlier, whose blue brow was exposed to the world. I asked him about that, and he went into a tirade of conspiracy theories, and we don't beat women. She made that up, and I'm sure you've heard these rumors before. What was interesting was how all the soldiers came to listen angry at me, but they didn't say anything in respect to the chain of command. But what I realized from that incident was that it was a clash of point of references, of myths, of ideas, of histories. It was almost as if we were speaking about two different Egypts. He was speaking about Egypt he grew up. This is not just talking about a generational divide. This is almost a revolutionary divide that separates this thinking, this sort of paternalistic thinking, compared to the way many activists and youth in general are very cynical and critical of authority. But I can say this though, from what I've seen over the years. Across the political and ideological spectrum, Egyptians are adamant about regaining their leading position in the Arab world. Even Islamists can exhibit a thinly veiled nationalism. I attended a lecture between, a debate between Subhi Salah of the Muslim Brotherhood and Amr Hamzawi from the Liberals. And Subhi Salah started off on a Quranic platform, a religious platform, but he ended by appealing to Egypt's pharaonic glory. And this is unusual for the Brotherhood to do this, but that's what he did. He invoked how Egypt was in the center of trade, the center of power, etc., etc. When I was translating for an Australian journalist, for a Salafi policymaker in the Hizb al-Nur party, she asked him, are you inspired by Wahhabi ideology from Saudi Arabia? He understood that in English, that he bypassed me. He got angry, He bypassed me, not needing for it to be translated. And he said, look, Egypt teaches, it is never taught. Ouch. Okay. Now, Stephen Cook, Stephen Cook in his book, Struggle for Egypt, states, movements, ideologies, knowledge, and culture tend to reverberate from Cairo in concentric circles to the rest of Egypt, then to the Levant, and to the Persian Gulf beyond. And it has always been able to do that. You know, we know the normal channels, the popular arts, from Al-Azhar University, which has a profound effect on the Islamic world, not just the Arab world, or the Sunni Islamic world, and foreign policy in general. There's been, let me just try and give an explanation of how the dialects of the Arabic language interacted, because it is a crucial underpinning of the Egyptian, of the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring. I'm not finding another way to put sand on that stick tape. Okay, now, 50 years ago, someone going from Lebanon to Morocco would not be able to speak the modern standard Arabic. They could, but they usually forget it after high school. You didn't really speak modern Arabic, modern standard Arabic, if you didn't engage in diplomacy or in banking or in any of these fields. So they would usually resort to the Egyptian dialects to communicate. So what we had was that this part of the world had a disproportional effect on the rest of the Arab world in terms of linguistics. But what Al Jazeera did, and Arabic satellite TV, was that it standardized the Arabic language in the sense that it used standard Arabic language across the board. So what you found was that Arabs were talking to each other in the same language again. So it sort of democratized the Arabic language. And this is a crucial underpinning because now everyone was understanding each other's narratives over the past 15 years. And one cannot speak of a re-emerging Egypt without finding what discourse it will use. As you might know, that Pan-Arabism was an ideology that was used by Nasser during the 50s and 60s, but Pan-Arabism was actually from Syria and Iraq. And it started to wane after the 1967 war with the defeat by Israel. And you find Pan-Arabism decline, but nationalism increases. And so you find the 1973 war had nationalist goals to recover their territory, Egypt and Syria respectively. And the 1979 Camp David Treaty signals the death of Egypt's role, in effect, the paramount role in the region. Also in 1979, we see the rise of Islamism after the Iranian Revolution. But in the 1990s, scholars began to reconsider Pan-Arabism as the satellite era entered. And so it started a few concepts, like these are academic terms that we're using now, New Arabism or Mac Arabism or the Arab Public Sphere by Mark Lynch at Georgetown. Al Jazeera linked living rooms and a politicized common sphere that united diasporic protests into a single coherent narrative of regional rage through the events of the 2000s, Intifada, Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza, per se. And the satellite TV also provided insights into each country's struggles. So Egyptians could now see the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, and the Lebanese or the Syrians could see the Kafaya movement, or the Enough movement in Egypt in 2004. Then social media enabled a new critical generation to bypass entrenched networks of intelligence and operatives and oppressive policing, so to say. And Pan-Arabism shouldn't be overemphasized today because the demands of the protesters are domestic, jobs, food. No one's asking for abolishing borders. But the fact that it was sparked by Tunisia is very telling. Egyptians or other Arabs were not inspired by Georgia or by Iran, etc. They were inspired by another Arab country to move them. And by the 2000s, soft power not just had it actually dramatically declined. The word soft power in Arabic entered discourse, in the Egyptian discourse, called Gowanam. And so it was often invoked following every regional crisis. Egyptian proponents of the concept have often committed vehicle fallacy, forgetting that it's not that Egypt's soft power had declined, but it's basically the Mubarak policies had damaged Egypt's reputation, but the soft power was often there, whether it's the religion or the cultural arts, etc. However, Egypt could not influence like it could before. So now let's enter the international scene. And looking at flashpoints in Egypt's external relations. Sabri Abdullah was the late Prime Minister under the Sadat administration. He stated, if we, Egypt, wanted to have a good relationship with the United States, we needed to spend the night in Tel Aviv. Quite romantic. And here's the thing, a strategic relationship between the US and Egypt has a informal requirement of good Egypt-Israeli relations built into these ties, which means the US will always view Egypt through the prism of Israel. And this has made it difficult for the Congress to cut aid to Egypt in that regard, despite the human rights abuses under Mubarak, for example. But military intelligence underpins the peace with Israel, and the military intelligence in Egypt operates in a parallel universe above, disconnected from the public and intellectual discourse, where the peace is extremely unpopular in Egypt. Khalid Fahmy at the American University of Cairo labels this the Israelization of Egyptian foreign policy. What he means by this is that it's stripped the components, Egyptian foreign policy component of the right of return, Palestinian right of return, the settlement issue, human rights, and focused it and reduced it to a security component. And there is a widespread belief that Camp David has weakened Egypt's leverage over the Arab world in the sense that it removed its strategic threat from the south and created more wars as a result after that, emboldened successive Israeli administrations. Consistent polling has shown that 3/4 of Egyptians have asked for, have called for a revision of the peace of the Camp David Treaty. It doesn't mean they want war. They just want to address the loopholes in the Camp David Treaty. There's also been complaints from sectors of the military that the Egyptian armed forces that are being rearmed by the US is actually taking a very defensive posture, not an offensive one. And the turning point in Morsi's administration, what I have to say, is the brokering of a ceasefire in the Gaza war last November. It shows that the trilateral logic actually foments illiberal domestic policies in Egypt. So what Morsi did, the next day, he pushed his dissolution of the Constitutional Court and acquisition of exceptional powers. Okay, there's a great deal of fear of revolution in Egypt, particularly by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. There's a fear of a Cold War arising. After the initial uprising in Egypt in 2011, Saudi Arabia entertained the idea of creating a monarchy bloc by bringing Morocco and Jordan into it. And what drives Saudi Arabia mad is a possible Cold War like the 1950s and 60s. We had Nasser leading the Republican Arab republics, and the Saudi kings were leading. the monarchies and the conservative Gulf states. Egypt's foreign policy towards the Gulf states is based on calculation, as mentioned, involving three factors: competing with Riyadh over political importance in the region, and the Muslim Brotherhood do not see eye to eye with the Saudi elites at all, despite that they might both be conservative, and realizing its own economic interests and strengthening its policy of alliance across the Middle East. Also, the Muslim Brotherhood sees itself as supporting its counterparts, its franchise basically, throughout the Islamic world. And there is an implicit bargain that the Gulf will provide Egypt with financial support. It means in return that Egypt does not export its revolution to the Gulf. And one of the obsessions of the Gulf states is that an Egyptian-Iranian strategic pact does not materialize, which we'll come on to soon. There's a popular perception in Egypt that Qatar is secretly propping up the Muslim Brotherhood. Before the Arab Spring, there was a Cold War in the Middle East, which Egypt and Saudi Arabia were on one side, under the Mubarak regime that is, and Syria and Qatar on the other side. Now that's all been scrambled. Now, the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood are supporting the Brotherhood, there's circumstantial, Qatar is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. There's circumstantial evidence for that, not conclusive evidence, but and these are the factors: that the Muslim Brotherhood spent most of their expatriate lives in Qatar. The prominent Egyptian sheikh, Yusuf Qaradawi, was given Qatari citizenship and often railed against the Mubarak regime. Al Jazeera Arabic has taken a Muslim Brotherhood bias. Doha has hosted individual activists, providing them with refuge and employment, and trained many in Islamist activism. Many deals are not transparent, that is true. Muslim Brotherhood figures bypass the foreign ministry and engage directly with the Qatari leadership. Egypt has been granting Qatar some privileges that are not granted to other countries, and other theories are that Qatar is vying for the leadership for the Arab League. But if you look at the strategic reasons, what Qatar could be doing, what it's doing, to quote the Qatar Prime Minister, Hamad bin Jassim, he says, if Egypt is strong, all other Arabs will be equally strong. If you need stability in the Middle East, we should find that stability in the financial system in Egypt. What he actually means is that it has to be strong to protect Qatar and Qatar's interests. And Qatar is in need of need of strong allies, because its relationship with its direct neighbors, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, are fraught with difficulties. So an ally with Egypt would not crave Qatari resources, they don't share the border, and it will make it a safe and powerful friend. Another economic reason is that Egypt's markets are big enough for Qatari investments. But I think I will go with a pragmatic reason. It's the rise of Islamists, and it's seeing a trend throughout, because Qatari foreign policy is quite consistent throughout the Middle East and North Africa. It is supporting the Islamists because they see them on the ascendancy. And on top of that, news has just come in a couple of days ago that Qatar will not be funding Egypt anymore. And this makes pragmatic sense for them to do that, because they don't know who will be the prime political actor at the end of the day. The Brotherhood, the situation in Egypt is very politically fluid. I've got to say this about Egypt and Iran. They have a bizarre relationship because they defy the laws of Middle East history. Given that one is the epicenter of Sunnism and the other is the epicenter of Shiism, they should be at loggerheads. One is Arab, the other is Persian, but they don't seem to have consistent historical tensions, as one might think. Part of that is because the social structure is not anti-Shiite. Egypt has historically had the Fatimids rule Egypt 1,000 years ago, and they got along fine from what I read from the history books. But there isn't that Shia scare that you see in the Gulf. Although it is happening, but it's more because of ideological imports from the Gulf. At an elite level, we've seen King Farouk's sister prior to Nasser. She married the Shah of Iran, the same Shah that was ousted in 1979, and there was a considerable tension between the Shah and Nasser because of the Shah's warming to Israel. And relations improved in the 70s with Sadat when he moved into the US orbit. And relations turned sour following Camp David and the hosting of the Shah following the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But the problem with what Iran has done is that it really overcalculated its relationship in the Arab Spring. Mubarak resigned on the 11th of February, and Iran's revolution day is on the 11th of February. their clerics read too much into them. And it sent 2 warships a few days ago through the Suez, and they were let through. And it projected a self-perception of an Islamic revolution. I mean, there was no Islamic revolution. It's not to say there's no Islamist parties in government, that's a different matter. They gave Morsi the red carpet treatment, because you have to also remember, Iran is desperate to break out of the regional isolation. And Egypt is the closest thing you can find that match to break out of that isolation. Morsi attended a non-alignment summit late last year, and he was given the red carpet treatment, but he angered the Iranians when he praised the revolutionaries in Syria and condemned the Bashar al-Assad regime. And he mentioned the 4 caliphs which go against the ideology of the Shiites. And recently Ahmadinejad came to Egypt, and what many analysts view this is that it's a warning to the Gulf states that we need your money, the Gulf states, but we have Iran on the side as well, just as a reminder. We have this frame too. And Turkey has, obviously, many of us know that it's been turning towards the Middle East since the 2003 when prevented the US from sending troops to Iraq through its territory. The problem is that with the Turkish model, is that it's a very deceptive model. The Muslim Brotherhood often go on about, we want to be like the Turkish Islamic Party, have the same sort of economic success as them, etc. But it strips the reality of Turkey's history, of the EU reforms, the sophistication of Islamist parties there working at a local level, rising to the top. It cuts many of that. Then some geopoliticists are talking about strategic alliances between Egypt, Iran, and Turkey. I don't know why this is a popular one, but they use this one to say based on the historical ties, strong centralized governments, and that they can maintain security in the region. That is unlikely to happen, not because there's no historical precedent of it, but Turkey and Iran just don't see eye to eye in a geopolitical sense. And there is a sign that Egypt is trying to break out of the Western-imposed security architecture. Morsi's first visit was not to Washington, D.C., but to Beijing, which is a very strong signal in international relations. Egypt is trying to diversify its foreign policy alliances and by visiting Pakistan and India, when Mubarak took 18 years to visit India. The geopolitical ambitions that drive the cultivation of Egyptian-Sino ties follows that it's actually a common trend in the Muslim world where Pakistan, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey are significantly warming up to China as they see the tide turning and the US declining in the region, in the Middle East. And so Egypt is also gambling on the fact that the US can't afford to cut military aid to Egypt due to the number of US jobs that are on the line if such a thing took place. And so what can we make of Egypt's changing role? On the domestic scene, there is no decisive success by a singular force that could alter hegemonic order. Egypt is caught between a stalemate between old regime and new regime. The Brotherhood have not reached political mastery of Egypt, that's for sure. But what we're seeing is the group fighting to secure a costly alliance with one of its enemies before they unite against it. But one thing is for sure, that the days of sweeping Islamist victories are over. And so it would be probably ideal for the opposition to abandon the boycott option and hopefully rule out the military option, military intervention, because that would bring Egypt back to square one. I'd like to bring this quote by AIIA NSW when he says, whether they swear by the Quran, the Bible, or Das Kapital, too many Egyptians are simply no longer afraid. Police terror doesn't send them back home, it makes them angrier, more resolved to fight back. Certainly the price is high, paid for in precious blood and tears, but it is a cost hundreds of thousands of the nation's citizens have been proving willing to pay over and over again. And we should never discount the public factor, as much as we talk about political actors, etc. The public keeps rivaling the establishment and setting the bar higher. And this is something that's driving the Brotherhood, the establishment, and the military council crazy, is to how do you coerce a population that no longer fears imprisonment or even death on the streets. On the external front, the emerging worldview is that Egypt needs to re-energize its foreign policy and to take a leadership role. A strong Egypt is eventual in the long-term future, but not just because Egypt wants it to be that way, but the key players in the region, as we have seen, want to have a strong Egypt for their interest. And given the disseminated Egyptian economy and the fractured political system, Egypt may have to rely on alliances to compensate for its short-term weaknesses. And I'd like to end with this quote by a quote that I like to use for uncertainty, that addresses the question of uncertainty. In answer to the question, it's attributed to Mao Zedong, how would the world be different if Nikita Khrushchev, rather than John F. Kennedy, had been assassinated? And Mao Zedong replied, I don't know, but I doubt if Onassis would have married Mrs. Khrushchev. Okay, women's rights is a big issue. Like there have been, since the revolution, there have been a number of activist groups, women activist groups, and it arose in response to sexual harassment, which has become very notorious in Egypt at the moment. And so I wouldn't even say sexual harassment, that sounds light. It's become sexual violence and sexual assault across the country, but more concentrated in heavy populated areas, particularly in Tahrir Square. There are women movements such as Women Daughters of the Country, there's Women at the Red Line, then you have another one called Sons of Egypt, where you have men who defend women and women's rights. You have actually a women sample of these movements. They are disadvantaged because they are in the revolutionary camp, and the laws that are passed, they're not really enforceable. Many of the Brotherhood's laws don't seem to be enforceable. They're quite conservative. And unfortunately, it's a very urban phenomenon. Like what such women groups have to do is break out of the urban circles and move into the rural areas and show a woman their rights, etc. But to be fair, if anyone's seen the rural areas, it's all about survival. The recent case was the United Nations Convention on Women's Rights, where the Muslim Brotherhood actually, and I can't believe they did this, but they did it. They went to protest against it. And so the news headlines call this an unholy alliance between Egypt, the Vatican, Russia, and Iran, who are opposed to women's rights. And they use the excuse that it's against our culture, common pretext that, which are ludicrous at the end of the day. But also, nice that the other thing about the women groups, they're also a social media phenomenon. Sometimes I wonder how often do they actually physically meet up, but there is a lot of interaction, there is a lot of communication. But this is the world that I understand is well better, is that sort of the wired world, which cuts off many other women from the rest of Egypt, or from acquiring the rights. Egypt it's very hard to find someone who would support the Bashar al-Assad regime. Rarely. So Egypt views Syria as an Arab Spring state, as their counterparts, and Egyptians of all strides, whether Muslim or Coptic or revolutionary, Islamist, whatever, will support they will cheerlead for the equivalents in that part of the world. Last year, the first time a foreign flag entered the Egyptian parliament was a Syrian flag. When the Egyptian parliament convened and had a majority from the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafist movement, the Salafist party has been ruled, and it had a sprinkling of independents and secular politicians. But the Syrian flag was brought in, and it was a very strong symbolic gesture. Egypt has a strong stake in the Syrian revolution. It views Syria as its partner, as its historical partner. Many people, I don't know about Syrians, but many Egyptians would actually have said they would like a union with Syria. It doesn't mean it has to be a political union, but they have a strong affinity towards Syria. And see in the older generation, the memory of the union between Syria and Egypt from 1959 to 1961, where Nasser really screwed up that union. Basically treated Syria as a section in the foreign ministry, rather than treating them as equal partners. It was a very patronizing approach he took to Syria.